Welcome to another podcast with Willie. Today we're going to focus on the first book of the Bible, which is Genesis, especially Genesis 1, and that's a huge topic, but we will just do an introduction to more podcasts on Genesis 1. And Lebay, do you have anything to add to our introduction to get Willie going on Genesis 1?
Yes, I'm really interested in the topic. I've done a lot of research around Genesis, and I have to say, if you just read it at face value, it's an interesting creation story, but there's so much more to it, and it's again those layers. So I'm really looking forward to you and Willie's insights on the topic, and I actually just want to sort of start off asking you guys, as what do we read Genesis? Is it at the end of the day, is it poetry? Is there some historicity around it? I know Willie sometimes talks about, Sumerian history. Can we take some of this back to ancient Sumer? So I'm going to throw that over to you, Willie, as a starting point.
But maybe I can jump in first, Lebay. Maybe
Yes.
I can just share how I see it, and then maybe Willie can either, disagree or agree. But it
No,
will be
it's
good to.
100%.
Yeah. Well, Lebay, I think how I read Genesis 1, it is a song. It is a beautiful song about creation, and when you look at the how it's laid out for us, it is in a parallel way. Like day 1 is parallel with day 4, 2 with 5, and 3 with 6. And if you don't mind, I just want to mention just quickly how it's parallel. Like on day 1, you have light and time. And only on day 4, sun, moon, and stars. And I think Billy will help us to understand why it is only on day 4. And then on day 2, we have the sky, the waters above, and the waters below. And then on day 5, you have the birds for the sky, and then the fish for the waters below. And day 3 and 6 are parallel. Day 3, land and plants. And then on day 6, animals and man. So I think it is important to read it according to its type of literature. It is a song, and we know that a song cannot say everything about a certain topic. It just gives us some hints about what is the topic. If you sing a love song, you cannot say everything about love. It's just giving us some hints about certain things of love. So, Willie, do you think I am on the right track there?
Yeah, Kobus, no, I agree with you. I think what is important is to understand that this is an ancient piece of literature. And so often we read the book of Genesis and the creation story from a current perspective. And I believe next time we'll discuss a scientific angle on the creation story. But when we engage with this amazing piece of literature, it's important to understand that it originated in an ancient world very different from our own. So often when we read the Bible, we read our present concerns and our concepts that we have that has been formed through the scientific world that we're living in. We read that into the text. But the biblical author obviously didn't know about science. And he had a totally different way of thinking about the world. So what in my mind is important is to also understand where this piece of literature originated. The base material, if you want to call it that, the source material. So let's say Moses wrote this song. It's a beautiful song. Then still, I believe that he used some source material that was handed down from the fathers, going back even to Abraham. And Abraham, we know, have lived according to Genesis 11 in Ur, the city of Ur in Sumer, in southern Mesopotamia. That was where he came from. His family has lived there for centuries. It's clearly a long period that they have lived in Sumer. So he brought the material with him. And as we discuss Genesis and go through all the passages, we'll see it time and time again, how these basic Sumerian ways of thinking appears in the text. The stories, the concepts, the motives, the terms, the terminology. It's going back to ancient Sumer. So although it's a song, it's a beautiful song, the basic concepts involved and used in the song, they are very old, very, very old. And I think this is the very first point we should understand. It's not wrong to engage present concerns when we read this, but I think it's in the first place important to read it from an ancient perspective. And once we do this, the song can come to its own right. We can really appreciate it for the ancient way in which it is presented.
So, but just to interject there, so how did the people of ancient Sumer view creation? I assume there's some parallels between how they viewed it and Genesis.
Yeah, so there's an amazing parallel. So what we find here, let me first say something about, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth, or the heavens and earth. This heaven and earth, this term, for the ancient Sumerians and the ancient Mesopotamians, it just meant cosmos. You know, from a scientific perspective, we try to understand the starry heavens, celestial skies, we distinguish it from the earth, but we know we see things totally in a different perspective. For them, this term meant cosmos. So what he's saying is, in the beginning, God created the cosmos. And this is how he preceded. And then what we find is, first of all, even before God started the process of creation, the primeval waters, God did not create the waters. I think this is one of the most interesting things about this passage. We should think about it. Why first the waters? Then God started this process of creation, and the first light appeared. Let there be light. Now this is ancient Sumerian ways of thinking. At first there was the primeval waters. And then in the ancient Sumerian way of thinking, there was light in the waters. This light is associated or identified with the god Gibel. Now Gibel is the god of light, but in the songs about Gibel, they sang songs about the gods also, their temple songs, and that, you know, in the ancient times, songs were so general. But he is described in terms of the sun that rises in the morning, that early brightness just before sunshine. So what we have here is this very same image. So light, and then we have this process through which various things came into being, the firmament, and to distinguish the firmament from the earth. And this is exactly, it's also a Sumerian terminology. They referred to the heavens in these terms, the circle of heaven with the stars and the planets and everything, you know, rotating around us, or we have the impression of them rotating around us. And it gives the impression of a circle of heaven, of the firmament. And they had this very idea. It's not a light, it's an early idea. So all these things that we find here builds upon an ancient Sumerian conception, way of thinking. And this is the key to unlock it, in my way of thinking.
Is there anything we can add to, the waters above and the waters below? Is there any?
Yeah, but what I wanted to say is not that this Sumerian background is the key. To understand this background and the way it's presented, we need a key to open this, for us to make sense of this. And this is two metaphors that's involved here. The first one is the potter. So what the potter does, he starts from the water, the clay in the water, this process through which he creates things. So in the same way, God brought about the cosmos. But there's another metaphor, which is even more important, and that's a metaphor of birth giving, of conception and birth giving. Now, obviously, they didn't have a modern and scientific conception. But the exact same idea, this process of formation We find, for example, in Psalm 138, where he describes this process of embryo formation. He refers to the unformed state that we were in, right at the beginning of the conception. We are unformed grouping of matter, and then slowly but steadily we get formed. And this is the same word used here. Well, not the same word, but this word can be translated in the same way. It can be translated as it was unformed. It was unformed and void. So unformed means it has not yet taken form. So this whole process through which God created and made everything could be seen in terms of the cosmos taking form in the same way that an embryo takes form. It's the very same process. So the metaphor underlying, that's why the water is important. Because birth from water, that's the natural birth. Jesus refers to that in John chapter 3.
Interesting.
So this starting with water and being brought forth from the water and to eventually come about in this way. This is how the cosmos was formed. The potter formed it from the water. But the underlying, the most basic and most important metaphor is the one of embryo formation and the birth giving of the universe. So, Cobus, what you've said, it's a song. It's not only a song, it's a birth song.
It's a birth song.
It's a song about the birth of the cosmos.
But can I just add to that? If you look at Genesis 1's very first verse, in the beginning God created. Now that word beginning, it has elements of excitement, of optimism. And just think of the cry of a baby when a baby is being born. Is that excitement, that optimism, and that makes it wonderful to know that this is a birth song in the beginning. There's excitement, there's optimism, and there's expectation with that word in the beginning. So I really like that. Lebay,
I just what I find, if you look at the Hebrew tohu, talk about form. One of the meanings is unreality. So God takes unreality into reality.
Absolutely.
I find it very, very interesting.
It's unformed, then he forms the cosmos. Yeah.
Yes.
I would like to ask you a why question. Why do you think the Bible starts with Genesis? Is that a fair question to ask? Why does the Bible start with Genesis, a birth song?
Yeah, so it starts with this birth song, and it's the birth of the cosmos. It's the first thing that ever happened. It was when the cosmos was formed, when birth was given to the cosmos, when God created the cosmos and brought it about. So I think this is basically the place to start the discussion. Everything afterwards in history starts with this.
Is it true that the other nations, surrounding nations, also had their own story of creation? Or is the biblical story unique?
You see, this is quite important, is that the biblical story is unique in a certain sense and in a certain way. So take, for example, what I've just said. These things are also found in the Sumerian stories of creation. The most basic stuff. Some are very similar. What is also important is it has been proposed that the word create means divide. And now I believe in the beginning, when we read that, in the beginning God created the cosmos. He created it out of nothing. But this process of division, that's how God created. He divided light from darkness, but not day from night. That happened on the fourth day. So days and nights as we know it was not yet there. It was only light and darkness. And although he calls light day, that was the analogy that I've referred to earlier. This first light, this gibel that appears in the ancient primeval waters, was compared with the first brightness of the sun rising. So in that sense, light is day, but it's not yet, day is not yet divided from night. And then we read how the firmament is divided from the earth, how the waters above and below, everything, this whole process of division. And this process of division is quite interesting because in ancient Sumer, there was a song where the Lord, the God Enlil, where he created, he divided heaven and the earth, he made the earth, and on the earth there were seeds, he formed seeds that came forth from the earth. Very similar, very basic, but a similar kind of idea that we find here. But what we find here is that the author, let's say it's Moses, he is using this material in a certain way. So he divides it in 7 days. This is unique, absolutely unique. And I believe this is the purpose, the underlying purpose of this birth song. God created the world, the cosmos, through this process. But since God made the cosmos in 6 days and rested on the 7th day, we as humans should also, from the biblical perspective of ancient Israel, in terms of the 10 commandments, rest on the Sabbath day, the 7th day. Now, what is important here? Here's an amazing piece of information hidden in this. At what stage would this have been important in Israel's history? It would have been important when the Sabbath was first introduced, because it was a general view in the ancient world. The way to approach things was the following. The gods did it in this way. That is why we do it in this way. So since God has created the cosmos in 6 days and rested on the 7th, this is why we work 6 days and rest on the 7th. So this whole idea of copying in our cultic expression and practices and so on, what the gods did, this was an ancient way of thinking. The whole ancient world operated in this way. And this is how and this is now why I can say that I believe Moses wrote it. Because the period in which this was a concern, why should we keep the Sabbath, was right at the beginning when it was first introduced. Why should we keep it? Because God kept the Sabbath. And that's the main reason, in my view, for writing the song in this form, is to not only a birth song of the cosmos and God creating it like an embryo, getting, taking on form as God in this process, but the way that God did it was through 6 days. And since God did it in that way, we as humans should do it. And since Moses is so closely linked with the 10 commandments, I believe throughout Israel's history, I believe this is a strong argument that Moses actually wrote this piece of literature.
And it's interesting.
Using earlier material.
It is also interesting because Moses was part of their being slaves in Egypt, where they worked 7 days a week. There was no rest for them. And then as they exit Egypt, God wanted them also to have this pattern of Genesis. And this is the hint that a song gives us. A song doesn't tell us everything. So the hint in Genesis 1 is there needs to be rest. And the interesting also that the word Sabbath is a Hebrew word that means rest. You know, the Sabbath day is a rest day. And but in today's society, it's a virtue not to rest. You just go.
And the Sabbath was actually not first. Israelites were not the first to keep the Sabbath. We in the Ugarit texts dating from about 1200 BC, slightly earlier also, we find that not the Sabbath, but the 7-day week, they held the 7-day week. And even in the Earth 3 period in about 2000 BC in Sumer, where Abram came from, we read that the 7 days, the week of 7 days, originated from there also. So there was a long history, but at this stage it became important because it added certain cultic expression in Israel's daily lives. And they would have asked, why should we do it? And this was the answer. Yeah. What is also important is a question about the day. the word Yom, the day, the 6 days of creation and the 7th day. There's been a lot of debate on this. Why the sun? Why was the sun created on the 4th day? Now, what I find is so often scholars try, in their effort to understand these things, they try to formulate some kind of, when the author wrote that, his intention. They try to get to his intention in writing this passage. In my view, this is futile. I don't believe so, because it's so long ago, and you can formulate so many different possible intentions. But what they would say, many of the scholars, especially from the biblical criticism school, they would say that it was written late. They believe this passage was only written after the exile, or during what was especially after the exile. And then what they said is, what they say is that this is written to accentuate the greatness of God. You can, the plants can grow through God's power, even when the sun is not created. And also in another way, some would say, he would like to show that God is greater than the sun god, the god of the heathen. But in Babylon, the sun god was not important. It was unimportant. The important god was Marduk, the weather god, the storm god. So, trying to say that God is so great, he only formed the sun on the 4th day because he wanted to show that the sun god is not important. The sun god didn't play a large role. And this is actually quite interesting. The sun was only created, or not created, but in the ancient Mesopotamian way of things, the sun only appeared on the scene quite late. He was not the early. When the premial world was formed, the sun was not yet there in their way of thinking. So this is exactly what we find here in the biblical authors' ways of expressing it. This is just another reason why I believe that this base material, the source material for Moses, goes back to ancient Sumer. But what he does, he changes it into 6 days, and he brings in the monotheistic God as creator, although the concept of God here is also very interesting. And then he has a much more complex process how everything was created and so on. So there's very many things that's very unique to this passage, but it belongs to the ancient world in which the author should be situated.
Willie, and yeah, absolutely beautiful. The one thing that I just want you to elaborate on is, if you look at, and we spoke about this before, you look at the creation story, you look at the water, there is some parallels between the creation of the cosmos and the birth or creation of human beings. The one thing that I sort of thought of is, you've got the spirit of God, Ruach, above the waters, but then you have the spirit of God breathed into Adam. Can you expand a bit on that? And I don't know if you have anything to add to that as well, Quibus.
No, I will listen.
Yeah, so it's interesting that the Spirit of God is mentioned right in the beginning, early, verse 2. And that shows us that God's Spirit was involved from the beginning in this whole process. And next time when we also discuss the scientific perspective and so forth, I believe this process in which everything came about. Sometimes when we read this through the creation story, we read that the waters brought about. We read that the earth brought about. So this process of creation and made, it's not always God created out of nothing. There's a process in which the one thing produces another thing. It's a complex process. I do not believe, it's quite obvious that the author didn't have the scientific perspective. So he didn't write with present concerns in mind. But when using these words are, for example, the same words, especially the word may, is used in human formation in exactly the same way in Psalm 138. God formed us using the same word. But this formation process is not creating out of nothing. It's a process through which one thing leads to another thing. So this is an interesting process through which this cosmos came into being. And I think this is what is the essential part of this passage. is this metaphor of birth giving, of the child being formed, which is actually in this case the cosmos. And what is also interesting is that the author didn't make a mistake in placing the sun on the fourth day. So when we read, for example, about the creation of the sun, that's in verse 14, God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night. So here we have days being divided from night. Now this only happens when the sun is created. And then he proceeds and he continues and he says, let them be for signs and seasons and for days and years. So what he says is the obvious. Once the sun is created, seasons, days, and years commence. Before the sun, there are no years, there are no seasons, but there are also no days. So what he's saying here is that days, solar days, only started on the fourth day of creation.
So the cosmic clock was put in
place.
place.
So that when he says that when he talks about the 6 days of creation, that word day, you know, if you read it in the English, it says, okay, it's a day, it must be a solar day. That it's not the right translation. Yom doesn't necessarily mean a solar day. For example, in chapter 2, verse 4, the whole creation process from days 1 to 6, everything are grouped together and says, and he writes that this is the day in which God created the heaven and the earth. So here it calls this whole process a single day. So I think it's just plain wrong to assume that these various days are solar days. So it's not solar days. So when we read that it's evening and it's morning that day, it's just using the metaphoric Jewish way of reckoning a day. But what he's just saying, it's the beginning and it's the continuation of that particular period in which God created this or that. So what we should see from this very clearly is its periods of creation. On the fourth period, God created the sun, the moon, and the stars. That was when days, solar days, seasons, and years commenced, not before that. That was when the day was divided from night. So he has a very clear picture in his mind how this process evolved and how everything came about.
Interesting. Willie, I read somewhere, and I don't know if that is a correct way of thinking, that the way to express in those days who God is was to tell a story of creation. So if someone asks you, tell me more about your God, then you would share a story of creation. Is there some truth in that?
Well, I think one could say so, but you know, it's if you read the ancient stories, for example, when you said this is a song, it reminds me of so many texts I've read. Take, for example, the Hurrians. The Hurrians were great storytellers. They told, you know, about the creation of, or not creation, but the coming about, how the whole cosmos came about, and the gods, how they came about, how they were formed, all this conflict between the gods. There are so many stories, and all of them commences with the song of this or the song of that. So it's songs. It was delivered in the form of a song that was sung in a certain way. But I think we should be careful, because in that ancient period, there were so many gods. This was what changed with the Hebrew perspective, the monotheistic God. In that ancient world, for example, Enheduanna, she was the daughter of the great King Sargon the Great, the founder of the Akkadian Empire in about 2370 BC. She made a collection of temple hymns. Each temple for each god had a hymn. She brought it all together in a collection. The oldest hymn dates from about 2500 BC, and that's a hymn that was sung in the temple of Kesh. So there were these songs, you know, they were singing from the beginning. Every temple had a song of that temple in honor of that particular God. And that's the background. So I think to say who this God, the song tells us about the God, well, it's true in that sense, as I've just explained it.
Yeah. Now, if I can ask the question, what is the message that we can take from Genesis 1?
What would you say?
I would say that, when you look at how God created, starts with an announcement. God created heaven and earth. That is the monistic God, that He's the supreme God. And when you read Genesis 1, for me, there is order. God's a God of order. And when there is order, one can feel safe when there are boundaries, healthy boundaries. And God, when you read Genesis 1, had set the table for relationships, a relationship between God and human beings and other human beings, as well as human beings and nature. So God has set the table for relationships. And that is, I think, also the answer to the question, why did God create? Because God is a relational God. There was the Holy Spirit hovering. It gives us the hint of God's mysterious presence. And when you read the rest of the Bible, that it is true of the Holy Spirit. It is God's presence with us. And when the Spirit was present in verse 2 of Genesis, it is also the comfort, and the Holy Spirit is our comfort. So that is the message for me. God's a God of order. He's the true God. I don't need to doubt that. And that His Spirit is still with us, and that it is all about relationships for God.
Well, I think this also come into focus in the next story, the garden story. And I think in that story, the whole question of relationship comes much more to the fore.
Correct.
And I think in a certain sense, it's present here, so I can agree with you. Because on the sixth period of creation, God created mankind. And this was actually the climax of this process. So here we have this process, everything in a more complicated manner coming about, from very simple, very basic. First, light and darkness divided the firmament and the earth, waters above and below, the dry earth, then everything coming about. On the dry earth, the plants, the trees, all sorts of more complicated animals, eventually the large animals and humans. So humans are, in this story, the climax. And then the next story, the story of the garden story, God focused in more detail on a particular story about a human Adam. But clearly humans are very important in God's perspective.
Correct.
The ground of creation
is the climax of the story of creation.
There's something else I wanted to ask both of you as well is, if you look at Genesis 1 verse 12, it talks about the vegetation and the animals, and they say they bring forth after their own kind. Yeah. Why is it necessary, or why was it for the author necessary to emphasize the fact that they bring forth after their own kind? Or is that something?
Quite an interesting question at this stage. Yeah.
I apologize.
No.
Yeah. No, Willie, go. Please go.
From my point of view, it's just saying that, according to the plants. So this is the spectrum of the variety of what God has created. And no one can read, I think, all the kinds of things into it. But I think he's just trying to say that as this process continued, that which was created, there was things that came about from those things. Those plants were able to reproduce the same kind of plants, which is actually something quite, in current thinking, it's not the easy thing to do.
Mm.
You know today, you need DNA and X or so on. So I think for an author like that, it's quite interesting and amazing that something can reproduce itself. That I can have a plant and another plant coming about of the same kind, and humans, everything does this. It's quite amazing.
It's incredible.
Yalabai, I would have said I don't know, but it reminds me of the person who went to the minister one day and asked the minister, was Jonah really in a fish? And then the minister said, you know what? We need to ask Jonah in heaven one day. And then the elder said, but Pastor, if Jonah is not in heaven? And then the minister responded, then you ask him.
Yeah.
So we can ask Moses one day, Labai, then we will know exactly why.
He's going to be very busy. I've got lots of questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Labai, I see we have maybe run out of our time, but that just make it necessary for more podcasts and creation, because I have a lot of other questions to ask.
I do have one other question before
Okay.
we finish up, and that's around the seventh day and the fact that that God rested. Any thoughts around that? I mean, God is God, omnipotent. Was it that he tried to set an example for us, or is there something deeper when you look at God rested?
Can I throw in an additional question to that for Willie? Did God rest because he was tired?
Yeah, so what I've said earlier is that we should see this as the model, the divine model.
Mm.
So the reason for Moses writing this is he's trying to present a model for the Jews to keep the Sabbath. So if we don't see it in that way, I don't think it makes sense. We can have many other, speculations and stuff, but because he clearly states this in chapter 2, verse 2 and 3, I think there can be no doubt that this was the main objective with the creation story. Over and above glorifying God and all these beautiful things that we talked about, God as a potter, creating the cosmos, and a process very similar to it, in which an embryo is formed and a child is eventually born. All these things are extremely interesting and beautiful, but also in his back of his mind was, if this is the process through which God did it, you should also keep the Sabbath. So it was a great argument for them to keep the Sabbath. Yeah.
But now the question is, maybe that's a podcast on its own. How do we keep that Sabbath in the 21st century? Because it was part of the law of Moses, keep the Sabbath.
Yeah.
And what does that mean for the 21st century? Because we grew up that like Sunday is the Sabbath, and you don't do sport on a Sunday. When we grew up, because it's the Sabbath day, we need to rest. But that has changed completely. And how do we need to reconcile that, what is happening today with our upbringing, that we believe it's the Sabbath day?
Yeah, I think we should also, in the longer process of the biblical story, we should, once we ask that question, we should also discuss the fall and everything that happened in the garden story. And eventually God created these things, but then everything goes way, wrong in a certain sense. So what we have is, in a certain sense, a recreation. That started quite early, but the one who recreates is Jesus. And that's why the new day is the first day. And that's why we keep the first day. So that's also an enormously powerful statement. The first day, that's the first day of the week. It's not the seventh day, it's the first day.
Correct.
So although they've kept the seventh day, the Jews has done that, but because of what happened after creation, when things went haywire, there was a need for new creation.
Now, the reason
And
why
one who brings about new creation is the Messiah, the one that was raised from the dead on the first day.
Correct. And that's the reason why we don't go to church on a Saturday, but on a Sunday. Specific reasons for that. It's that concept of the new creation. Jesus raised on the Sunday. The Holy Spirit was poured out on a Sunday. So the church started, or the Christians or the followers of Jesus started to celebrate those events because it happened on the first day of the week
Absolutely.
and not on
Yeah.
the seventh day of the week. So it's fascinating, this kind of recreation.
So that means the creation story is actually continuing. In
That's
the end of the day, we read about the new heaven and the new earth. So now you see
Yes.
that is also important to understand. It's just we should just not just stay with the creation story in the beginning. There's a
But-
process. There's other things that will happen, and there's a recreation. That will
but
take
that
place
makes
here.
it beautiful, Willie, is that when Moses asked God, "Who are you?" I am what I am. I'm not rigid. I am what I am. God is not boring. I love the idea of recreation. It's
Yeah.
ongoing.
And in that sense, you can almost say that Genesis and Revelation stand side by side,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
it loops back.
Mm.
So yeah, and
And
yeah.
also, if you take John the Gospel John, chapter 1, verse 1, in
Yes.
the beginning was the
Yes.
Word.
And we can, if we have time later on one of our talks, we can actually come back to that, because I believe that comes out of this one of these passages that we are discussing just in Genesis 2 verse 4.
Labai, sorry.
Yes, no. So one thing I just wanted to add as well is that we have to realize that the New Testament is hidden in the Old Testament, and the Old Testament is revealed in the New Testament, and that there's one golden thread that runs right through.
Yeah, no, that is so true.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it is so important to talk about these things. You can never consume the Bible, the depth and the wealth of the Bible. Even if you are not a Christian, when you read the Bible, it's a masterpiece. It's a literally masterpiece. And as we believe that good theology is good counseling, many people don't want to know more because they are afraid that they will maybe doubt their faith and maybe other things will happen in their journey. But we need to stretch those muscles, those faith muscles, and explore these things. Because when you explore these things, you will realize that you actually know nothing, but it makes you humble, and it wants you to glorify God more, because it is just amazing, these things. So thank you, Willie.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you really start digging into the Bible, it just reaffirms the trustworthiness of the Word of God. And a friend of mine said the moment she started really digging into the Bible, it just strengthened her faith overall. And then I've one last thing: through him, all things were made; with him, nothing was made.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. All the best for you guys.